Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion a bit. But anyway, here's my bit to start off with. And I actually wanted to start just posing a question. Do we need a definition of anti-Semitism? And actually, why should we treat anti-Jewish racism different from other forms of racism? And it actually makes me uncomfortable. It seems like another sort of Jewish exceptionalism. So, do we need a definition of anti-Semitism that's different from anti-racism? Sorry, different from racism, being against anti-Semitism, being against racism. But actually, I wanted to step back even further and question the demand for anti-racism legislation altogether. I mean, does it actually help prevent racism? And the laws that we have, it's inherently problematic because racism is quite difficult to define. If we accept, and I imagine that everybody here does, that race is a social construct, it's not actually a definable entity, but it's created by society, the idea of race, then what actually is racism? I mean, often it's obvious when there's racism, but not always. If you look at the 210 Equality Act, it states that a racial group is a group of persons defined by reference to race, which doesn't get us a lot further, but the Act then expressly states that, according to the Act, race includes A, colour, B, nationality, C, ethnic or national origins. It still doesn't define ethnicity, but otherwise it's potentially very inclusive, all those things. So could perhaps any comment on national characteristics might fall foul of this if we start talking about, say, the Scottish cringe or the English stiff upper lip or a million jokes? Are they going to fall foul of that definition? And it was this very wide definition, together with a pretty lousy defence lawyer, that allowed a young Palestine activist to be labelled as racist by Cooper Sheriff Court in 2012. I imagine some of you will remember that. He'd, middle of the night student, defiled an Israeli flag, ended up with a community sentence and sent down from St Andrews University. The Equality Act lists protected characteristics that you can't discriminate against. And this includes beliefs, but it doesn't include political allegiance. And that's why we had the strange thing when Christopher McKelney, the SNP councillor who lost his job as an electrician with the MOD when he stood to be deputy leader of the SNP, to show discrimination under the Act, he had to demonstrate that his support for independence was a philosophical belief. In other words, that he was a dyed-in-the-wool cultural nationalist and not supporting independence because it could bring a better society. And actually, the judgment in his favour makes this very clear, and I quote, "The claimant was clear in his evidence that he does not believe in Scottish independence because it will necessarily lead to improved economic and social conditions for people living in Scotland. It is a fundamental belief in the right of Scotland to national sovereignty." So, once you get the law into things, it gets quite complicated. And altogether, sort of anti-discrimination and anti-racist legislation has proved quite a legal minefield. In fact, many racially motivated acts can be prosecuted without recourse to specifically anti-racism legislation. So if it's an incitement to violence or public disorder, or if it's defamation or harassment or simply criminal violence, it can all be prosecuted as those things. And, one might ask, I'd throw it open really, is a violent attack or any of one of these things, is it actually worse if it's racially motivated or just because you hate the person or hate the cut of their jib? I don't know. Does it make it worse? Specific race relations legislation was first introduced in 1965, and that allowed people to be prosecuted for incitement to racial hatred. It didn't have to be incitement to racial violence, but just incitement to hatred. And it also allowed people to consider defamation of a whole racial group, not just defamation of individuals. But the vagueness of definitions in this area really made the whole thing rather more useful for lawyers building their careers than for stopping racism. And everything would hinge on wrangling over definitions, so what's meant by hatred, is this an insult, what would be the response of these sort of legally defined reasonable people to what had happened. And it led to some quite surprising acquittals of things that were quite clearly carried out by racists, but in law they managed to get off. And of course that can actually just strengthen them because it makes it look like the law is supporting them. And has also led to incrimination of some minorities who've been fighting against discrimination. So even in 1967, so just 2 years after that act, you had 4 members of the Universal Coloured People's Alliance convicted of stirring up hatred against white people, and in a separate case, the Black Power leader sentenced for 12 months. And then, of course, there's the problem of free speech. And I was going to read quite a wrong warning from Liberty about this. So they write, "The right to freedom of expression is crucial in a democracy. Article 10 of the Human Rights Act safeguards the right to free expression, which includes the freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without state interference. The right to free expression is, however, not absolute. It can be limited to protect the rights of others. Any limitations on the right must be necessary and proportionate, and criminalising even the most unpalatable, illiberal and offensive speech should be approached with grave caution in a democracy. Criminalising the incitement of violence or threats can be seen to be a justifiable limit on freedom of expression. What is controversial is the criminalisation of language or behaviour, which may be unpleasant, may cause offence, but which is not inciting violence, criminality, etc. We believe there needs to be a wholesale review of speech offences, particularly under the Public Order Act. These offences can be counterproductive, giving extreme groups publicity in the event of any trial, can have a chilling effect on legitimate debate and peaceful protest, and have been extended in an ad hoc and piecemeal way. There have been very few prosecutions under these offences, and there is therefore an urgent need to review their efficacy and impact." So really the law is a very blunt instrument with lots of unintended consequences, which doesn't mean, of course, that racism shouldn't be addressed by us as a society. Though even out with the law, attempts at control can misfire. And I mean, obviously that's not to suggest that anything goes and we should, but just that we always need to consider both our tactics and the likely consequences of them. So I think that at the moment, the tendency for this sort of very widespread no platforming can be quite counterproductive and can give a certain credence to people on the far right who claim to be defending freedom of speech. Though, of course, one should never give a platform to a fascist. But perhaps that's enough of sort of general introduction. You come here to hear a bit more about the IHRA definition. So just to look at the origin of that definition, so it stands for the International Holocaust Memorial Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And the definition and the examples that go with it were developed in 2003 to 5, and they were developed as a working draft. It was never seen as the finished article, by the European Monitoring Centre on Racism and Xenophobia. And what they wanted, they were monitoring anti-Semitism in lots of different countries, and they wanted a standard definition that they could measure them all up against. The International Holocaust Memorial Alliance was founded in 1998 as a task force for Holocaust education, remembrance and research. And they just adopted the definition wholesale in 2016, basically just to save them having to write their own. And the definition has always had both supporters and critics. And the main author of the original definition, Kenneth Stern, has since spoken against how it's been used to shut down academic debate, and he's argued against it being given any sort of legal status. But it has been given official recognition by several governments, including the UK government and the Scottish government. But the problems aren't in the definition itself, but in some of the examples that are attached to it. And these examples deliberately conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. So in particular, I'm going to quote two examples. And the first is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And then the second is drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. And I think that these would really seek to brand as anti-Semitic really important political arguments that we should be having. I think we need to be able to make the argument without being classed as anti-Semitic, that the creation of a specifically Jewish state is intrinsically a racist endeavor, as it would be if it was any state that was defined by ethnicity or religion. And this isn't to say, that Jews should leave Israel or they should be driven into the sea or any of the other sort of graphic descriptions that are given. The problem is not the Jews living there. The problem is the nature of the state, that it's a specifically Jewish state, that it's a state that prioritizes one ethnic group above others. And it's that needs changed. It's the nature of the state. Although the Jewish religion has always looked forward to Jews returning to Israel after the coming of the Messiah, Jews don't accept that the Messiah has come. And support for Zionism, which would be defined as the creation and maintenance of a Jewish state in the historic land of Israel, is not intrinsic to being Jewish. It's not, Zionism isn't intrinsic to Jewishness. And it's always been a subject of argument among Jews, especially in Eastern Europe. So it's traditionally very much rejected by Jewish international socialists who argue that Jews should fight for being fully accepted where they live. And it's also been rejected by some of the ultra-Orthodox who feel that we should be waiting for the Messiah and not going ahead creating Israel beforehand. And so the rejection of Zionism is not a rejection of Jews or Jewishness and is often made by Jews themselves. Of course, I understand the appeal of Zionism following the Holocaust, when no one gave Jews sanctuary. But that problem can't be solved so simply. It's in fact, what's happened, the creation of the specifically Jewish state, has made the situation much worse for Jews as well as for Palestinians. So to use a sort of biblical phrase, I believe it's hardened hearts. And it's also increased anti-Semitism because Jews are associated in people's minds with Israel. We would argue in our group that to assume all Jews as Zionists is in itself anti-Semitic, like assuming all Jews have any other political view or characteristic. We're very, very varied. But the right-wing Jewish establishment do just that. And then that second point that they would deem anti-Semitic, the second argument that we're not going to be allowed to have, I think if a state is following policies that have echoes of Nazi Germany, it's really important to be able to point that out, whether we're talking about Trump's USA, Erdogan's Turkey, Bolsonaro's Brazil, or Netanyahu's Israel. And no one's saying that any of these have a full Nazi regime, but we need to point out parallels with the 1930s to try and address those issues before they get there. And Israel should not be exempt from this. Nowhere should be. Support for the IHRA definition, of course, comes from the Zionist lobby. They're basically losing the argument with very many people about the need for Zionism. So rather than have that argument, they're attempting to delegitimize the argument, just say you can't have that argument, you've got to take it off the table and make it that whole argument unacceptable. But the definition has also been jumped on by the right wing more broadly, who don't care a jot about anti-Semitism, but see this as a useful tool for beating the pro-Palestine left, and especially, of course, Jeremy Corbyn. So you get the absurd situation of right-wing papers and people like the Daily Mail accusing Corbyn of being racist and anti-Semitic. I mean, you really couldn't make it up. I hope that they've gone too far and people can see all this for the smear campaign that it is. But obviously, some mud does stick. And at the very least, they've succeeded in distracting attention from the main political debates and attack on austerity. So that the left is always being pushed, it gets pushed onto the back foot with this, always having to defend themselves against arguments of anti-Semitism. And I think actually Corbyn's conceded much too much ground. Of course, I'm not saying there's no anti-Semitism on the left. Of course there's some, but much, much less than on the right. It's made a bit more complicated because I think there are too many people who don't always recognise anti-Semitic myths and memes, things like the Rothschild conspiracy and now Soros conspiracy when they see it on the net. So people think that they're sharing something that's sort of against bankers generally, but actually it's against Rothschild and Jewish bankers, or Soros as the modern version. I think that people are rightly very, very sceptical about establishment sources like the BBC, but there's a bit of a tendency to, perhaps it's almost like my enemy's enemy is my friend, to be a bit too welcoming of sources that criticise the BBC and not applying the same level of critical analysis to those. And in fact, many of those sources originate with far-right websites. I think people will be quite horrified some of the things that left-wing people share that have originated in far-right sites. Perhaps we're getting a bit better at it, but it's still happening too much. But that's not basically saying that there isn't an anti-Semitism problem on the left. I don't think. I think there's a bit of an ignorance problem sometimes in some of the things we share and noticing what we're doing. Sometimes we even share things just to point out how ridiculous they are, but that can still be misinterpreted. But I certainly haven't come across an anti-Semitism problem on the left. But this is a major way of attacking the left. It's a major smear campaign and witch hunt. And the irony is, of course, that the only real counter to racism is a strong left to attract people as an alternative to right-wing populism, a left that can actually address people's underlying concerns about inequality. And with the rise of the far right everywhere, this is getting more and more vital. And I think it's really important to recognise that the rise of the right that we're seeing generally is only possible because of the decline of the left. And as we've seen yet again with what's happening in Brazil, the conservative right, the sort of what they would think of as the more, not the far right, but the sort of conservative parties would always rather concentrate their attacks on the left than on the far right. And then when so-called left parties try and appear moderate and concede ground to the middle, they lose credibility. And we've just had such a major decline of the left, both from those attacks and from left parties destroying themselves. I just thought I'd end with two news events from this week. So just today, I don't know if people saw, there was a report from Dudley about a council worker who was suspended from their jobs for calling Israel a racist endeavour. And that was because Dudley Council had adopted the IHRA definition.
Sorry, could you repeat that again? I missed it.
So it's a council worker in Dudley. He actually works on equality and stuff in Dudley, and he's been suspended from his job by Dudley Council because he took part in a pro-Palestine protest with a banner calling Israel a racist endeavour. And that's because Dudley Council has adopted the IHRA definition. And I can't talk about anti-Semitism this week, obviously, without mentioning the shooting in America. This very much demonstrates the rise of anti-Semitism that comes with the rise of the far right. But it also, I'm afraid, demonstrates the failure of Zionists and the Israeli right-wing politicians who are drawing false parallels with what's happened there with attacks on Israel. They just can't resist trying to equate a quite clearly far-right attack with Palestinian terrorist attack, or there's what they try and say, it's all the same. It's all, and it's particularly ironic because that particular congregation was singled out by the attacker because they were specifically not a racist congregation and helped immigrants. So, they was as far away from both Trump and also Netanyahu as they could be. But hopefully that's enough to get a bit of a discussion going. So, thank you.
It's terrific. Thank you.